Good morning. Thank you all for coming. We have a colorful, dramatic presentation on the changing the safety culture using the power of data, right in line with the theme for this year's Risk Summit. So the three things we're going to cover are the importance of having data, using data. We're going to talk about the metrics that we've captured, developed, what it is you're going to measure, and then how you present that data in a way that's convincing and informative, so you get your message across. So my part is the easy part. I got to talk about why it's important to do this. Essentially, safety culture, of course, is the way, the attitude, the beliefs, the value systems, and the actions that we use every day in deciding what we're going to do, how we're going to do it. How is it? I mean, what is it that data is going to do to improve that interaction, that value system? When I have a desire to lose weight, to get in better shape, I just have that desire. I don't have any way to measure what my weight is. I have no idea if I'm making progress. That's useful, right? A scale. What's really more important, though, is the jawbone my wife gave me that helps remind me what my activity level is every day. So the closer you can get the data to reality, the more quickly you can provide feedback to provide guidance to the people that are actually doing work, making decisions that are going to impact the safety culture. So first we had to ask, what's the campus doing? How is the campus doing? How is the campus doing with respect to the goals the campus have, the university has? How is the H&S doing in supporting the goals? And then how do we get the data together? Before we hired someone to fulfill the role of being an analyst to analyze the data we were gathering, we would wait until like 2 minutes before the budget was due, and then we'd make up a bunch of numbers and produce a bunch of graphs, and then submit that with the budget information. And it was never systematic, never really verified, and always a nightmare. You're going to see some of the data that happened as a result of that effort. In my view of the universe, what we do could be just like this. Are we walking upstairs? Are we walking downstairs? Are we making progress? Are we making a difference? And the role of the analyst is this little person here just watching it. What are they doing? How can you measure how many times does somebody go by this line? And I always figure my role is down here, sitting down here worrying about it, figuring what we're going to do to improve based upon the data that's provided. So who I have up here at the table is Janette Ducut and Cassandra Greenawalt. They're both here to provide their piece of this presentation, and I encourage you to hang out. So with that, Cassie's going to talk about the metrics.
Good morning. So first we'll talk about the data. So the first step in really reporting is collecting data, right? And we'll touch later on some of the systems that we can use to help you gather data, survey tools and whatnot. But we'll talk first about what do you do with data that's already being collected, probably in systems that have existed for years and data's just gathering. What do you do with that data? How do you organize it in a way that can actually be analyzed? And so what we have up here is an example from our respiratory protection program. That program has about 5 elements that are important to us. We want to look at medical surveillance, hazard assessments, training records, volunteer use form for the volunteer users of the respirators, and fit test results. So when we sat down to try to analyze all the data, we looked and we're like, well, all this data, all this information is in 5 separate systems. How can we possibly analyze it, right? So the first step is to consolidate the information from these separate systems. It took a little bit of time, but once all of the data from these separate systems, we had a questionnaire database from 3M, training records from the UC Learning Center, we had fit test results from a device that went straight into a system. Port account, thank you. Once we merged all of these together in a master database, we were able to analyze it better. And how we did that, it was a little time consuming, but we tied all of these factors to each respirator user into one database. It was our master database that was simply created in Excel. But by doing it in Excel, we were able to input formulas and calculations, so that way at any time when the data is updated, when a user takes training and it's updated in the system, those percentages are manual or automatically calculated for us. So again, this slide is just to stress the importance of the consolidation of your separate systems, electronically archive any hard copies that you have. So we had hard forms of volunteer users filling out forms, and we had to scan them and archive them, which we'll show you later how to manage your records a little bit better. And then also it's very important to provide proof that each data point exists. So once your data is collected and organized, consolidated, it's important to graph it visually in a way that makes sense to your viewers, right? Pie charts are a very simple example of this. Pie charts can be used very basically. As you can see an idea by looking at the pie charts what the majority is of a set of numbers, a set of data, right? Pie charts are also very useful in showing different kinds of data. We have on the far left in the radiation safety world the number of isotopes from radioactive materials deliveries. You can see there the majority of the isotopes that were delivered that year. We also have, we can use pie charts to graph frequency. We did a customer service survey, and we asked how frequently do you use a specific department's services? And we used a pie chart to graph the survey taker saying, oh, I use this department's services frequently or infrequently, or in this case, never, not so much. You can also use pie charts to graph safety inspections, so the kinds of inspections that EH&S conducts each year, and you can see here a good visual representation of the diversity of the different kinds of inspections. So again, pie charts are very useful. They're very simple for the viewers. However, they lack the intricacy of comparing data. So there are some other graphics that we can use to compare data a little bit more effectively. And some of those will be discussed now. Here we can see column charts. So again, column charts are very useful in comparing data. The first example, we have an annual comparison. This came from our hazardous waste pickups report, and you can see the number of containers that were transferred to waste accumulation in one year versus another. So we have the data from 2013, which is compared to 2014. You can also compare performance. So up here we have corrective action plan completeness, and you see root cause, preventative action, and responsible party. It shows in the world of what we expected to happen or what was possible to happen, what was actually done or what is done at this point. So I found that this kind of graphic is very useful for the viewer who sees, okay, what did we expect and what is the current state? And again, all of these graphics are very easily created in Microsoft Excel. So at the bottom, we have an average comparison. So this was closed cases of, I believe, accident investigation. So you can see the number of closed cases each quarter versus the average of comparison. So again, it's important when we're looking at analyzing data, what is the data versus, you know, everything else? What did we expect? And then lastly, we have a categorical comparison. So this is specifically for training completions. You see online training versus classroom training. And really what this shows is it's showing our reach, right? How many people are we reaching with our training? As soon as a new training method was introduced, we were able to reach more people. So again, this is a good way to show comparison of data. Another way to compare data is by using bar charts. Bar charts are, I found again, are very useful for the viewer. You can also do performance comparisons, category comparisons, and average comparisons this way. The first example is an example of safety culture, right? It's what we're all talking about now. And as a result of people participating in a certain safety program on campus, how are their beliefs, their values, their performance, or nothing changing at all, right? And you can see as a result of participating in our department safety coordinator program, a majority of individuals reported that this program impacted their safety culture beliefs and values. The second comparison is, again, a category comparison. This also comes from our customer service, the customer service survey that we conducted. We asked people to rank certain quality of service components, the professionalism, availability of information, responsiveness, things like that. You can see very easily what people rated as satisfied or very satisfied versus what they were dissatisfied with. So in this case, this is real data from EH&S. People were very satisfied, at least 82% in all of the categories, but mostly with our professionalism. And lastly, we have an average comparison. This is a comparison of EH&S staffing across all of campuses, but again, compared to what, right? So we have the average line, which is here, and you can see where some campus EH&S staffing falls below or above that. Another graph type is the line chart. Everyone's very familiar with the line chart. Line charts are great for seeing data trended over time, something that the bar charts doesn't do so well. So the most basic line chart is just something completed over time. We have an example of our chemical inventory updates, the status, right, on campus. We have the campus-wide completion percentage, and you can see how the percentage fluctuates throughout the year. It's much more powerful to plot two data points at the same point in time, and that's what we've done here for the business continuity plans. This is completion, so the green line shows plans that have been completed, and the blue line is showing plans that have been engaged, so where our business continuity planner has reached out to the department and begun interacting with them, but maybe not completed the plan just quite yet. So you can see, maybe we haven't reached as much completion as we've wanted, but we've engaged a lot of those plans that are in progress. So again, a good visual representation of that. And lastly, we're showing again a completion versus average of previous years. So this is our training completions across the academic year. The blue line represents the 2014 total, where the red dotted line represents an average from 2005 to 2013. So again, this representation is very easy for the viewer to see. Training completions have increased compared to the average of years before, and it also allows you to see how training completions fluctuate throughout the year, right? They kind of ebb and flow at the same rate. You can see training completions are highest in October, right when school's just started and people have training requirements to satisfy, and also decreases right in summertime when everyone's getting ready to leave campus. Another way to represent data is by using tables. Tables are very useful because they kind of give the information to the user and let them decide how they want to interpret it. On the left, you see a table. Again, this is our chemical inventory completions. You have all of the organizational units and the departments underneath them. It's a very good representation. Someone can easily find a department they're looking for based on the organizational unit. And we'll talk a little bit about color later, but it has the percentage of how many rooms, how many have an updated chemical inventory, have updated their chemical inventory, and then the overall percentage, which is identified by color. This table right here is just showing people who have not met their radiation safety training requirements. You have individuals and the training that is lacking and what department they're in. This kind of table typically follows a pie chart of training percentage completions, right? So how many people have completed their training, how many have not. Following the pie chart comes a table which shows, okay, what do I do with this information? We have this group of people who hasn't completed their training, but how do we act on that? How do we reconcile that? And that's by finding the individuals using the table. Tables can also be used to rank information. Here we have top 5 audit issues that were found during self-audits. These are self-reported by labs and put into a table of what was reported the most. So in this case, waste storage exceeding the limit, right? A lot of people reported that was an issue. Those are the top 5 issues. Then we have the 5 most deficient food facilities identified during inspection. So when we go out and inspect these food facilities, what are the most deficiencies and which restaurants are reporting the most of those? Another type of graphic display is infographic. You see this a lot now in magazines and some advertising, right? This is a very direct way of giving the information to the viewer. So instead of inundating them with information in tables and charts and things like that, you can give them a quick graphic that tells them exactly what you found, exactly what you want them to know, and tie it with a graphic that helps them kind of connect the information to a visual. So in the first table, we have controlled substance use requirements. We require training, personnel screening, and biennial inventory. So instead of showing separate graphs, separate pie charts or bar charts, for that we just tell the people, so 91% of these people have satisfied their training requirements, 100% of biennial inventories have been conducted, and we tie that with an image to help catch their attention and connect the information. We do that also here with confined space hazard assessment completions versus indoor versus outdoor. Same thing with laboratory safety requirement compliance, the chemical hygiene plan, chemical inventory updates, and audit. So you see the percentages very quickly. You don't have to do any kind of interpretation or deciphering the information at all. It's given to you. The middle row, you can very quickly see this is all has to do with training, right? So how has training increased from last year? What is people's overall reaction to training? Are they learning? I like this graphic at the bottom because it's an infographic which is superimposed over a graph that was completed for the number of respiratory fit tests that were completed 1 year versus the next. So you kind of see that it's increased, and then the infographic tells you by how much, so you don't have to try to calculate that with your eyes, right? So once you've collected the data, you've organized it, and you found a way to represent it visually, how do you put a report together? We're going to discuss that a little bit here. I wanted to show you an example of our campus-wide chemical inventory report. It's that table we showed you earlier. And again, the important thing here is that departments can easily compare themselves against others. So this report is typically given to department leadership or the chair of a department, the dean of a college, who can identify, okay, where are we lacking in certain areas and where are we excelling? The cool thing about this report, it's generated a lot of feedback and conversation with departments on campus, and also generated a lot of change. So when the leader of a department sees this, they know exactly where to go to correct things that need to be corrected. And so if I am the chair of a certain department, right, I can see exactly what our percentage is, and then I can contact EH&S and get a report like this, which is department specific. So we create reports for each department that shows them space by space what inventory is expected, who's the PI, and have they met that requirement. So again, this report has been very effective in communicating with the departments and creating the change that we want to see, getting something to happen because of it. Another example is the EH&S staffing report. So this report was conducted to show the staffing needs maybe for different campuses. So before we get into the content, we'll talk a little bit about how it's very important to create headers for reports and to introduce the sections before you discuss the data that's actually there. And then also, again, we touched on this earlier, showing comparisons along with the average. So instead of just giving people data, you want them to be able to make a decision compared to what, right? So do our staffing levels, are they better than other campuses, worse than other campuses compared to the average, okay? So in the same report, we have EH&S staffing compared to employee support, facility support, student support, and operations support. What we want to point out here is that it's very important to indicate sources. We sometimes just use hyperlinks and print these reports as PDFs so people can just click on the source and be taken right to it. It's very important that they're able to locate where you found that information. And then also to normalize the data. So again, this is EH&S staffing. It's normalized per 1,000 employees on that campus, okay? So right now we're not just, we're able to compare apples to apples by normalizing data this way, okay? Another example, this is the Respiratory Protection Program report. So that master database that we showed you in the beginning where we consolidated all this information from all these sources was used actually to generate this report. This graph actually comes from the Excel spreadsheet that's automated, so we just copy and paste it directly into this report along with the other information that you see. Again, I want to point out that it's important to consolidate like data. So we could have very easily taken these program requirements and graphed them individually, but we consolidated them and put them into the graphic here. Again, the chart that shows what did we expect to happen. You see it's outlined in red. That's 100% of what we wanted to have had happen, and what did we actually achieve in that time period. And you can see each component, how are we doing. It's also important to identify the location of occurrences. Here we were interested in finding out where do most of our respirator users lie, what departments do they come from, and that's shown in that pie chart at the bottom. And the last thing I want to point out is illuminating incomplete activities. So we do that in red, and I know it looks very mean and angry, but it's important to do that to show either department leaders or our own leaders, our directors, and some of our subject matter experts, okay, where can this program be improved? When you're dealing with the data on a constant basis, sometimes you overlook that, and an analyst can help point that out. It's also important, I'll emphasize this again, to show deficiency so others can take action. So instead of, again, inundating people with all of this information, you want to show them the information and then show them how they can correct it. So by viewing this one report, we see, okay, training is incomplete. How can we reconcile that? How can we fix that? By, contacting these people and having them follow up with their training. Oftentimes in the reports, you'll see graphics that are described, right? So we'll show here 3 methods for describing data. The first is very simply discussing the majority, okay? So if you're talking about training, have most people completed their training or have most people not completed their training? And we do that here. This was actually from the Department Safety Coordinator program. What's your overall reaction to the program? And you can see that a majority of individuals thought this program was good or very good. A second technique is to identify the highs or lows. We did this with the training example I showed you earlier. You can see training is the highest during this time, lowest during this time, and that's what the description here says. The pattern, the training completion pattern follows the academic year, which indicates that research and teaching activities increase the demand for training at certain points in the year, and you can see that by looking at the graphic. And lastly, you want to point out the extremes. So this is similar to the highs and low in the line chart, but using the bar chart here, you talk about where were people most satisfied, where were they most dissatisfied, and write that in the description here. We'll talk about survey tools really quickly. I'll very briefly touch on this. So something that helps you collect data are these survey tools. We often used Adobe Form Central. Unfortunately, that's no longer available for use, but we preferred that over SurveyMonkey, which was not as user-friendly. It didn't allow us to drill down, and really the design set wasn't quite there. But other form tools that you can use are WooFoo, JotForm, Medallia. They're used by big businesses. They're free. You get responses emailed to you, so it's very easy to manage the data using these systems. And then lastly, we'll touch on records management. So there are some things, this is actually, I mentioned the respirator protection database that we have. These are actually saved versions of the database, which we've saved by database, then the year, the month, and the day that it was actually created. It looks busy, it looks crazy, but it's very easy to search. And the cool thing about saving data this way is you're not saving over information. So if I'm curious, what was the status of the respirator protection training, I can go to this data point at any point in time here in January of this year. I can go back and look by saving data that way. It's very useful. It's helped us search and archive data. By saving food permits and the IIPPs, different plans and forms this way, you're able to search them easy. You can also select all of these, copy and paste them into Excel and search them easily that way as well. And so we found that this is a really great way to manage our records. Again, archiving data, exporting your data regularly, sharing account access so that everyone has access to the data, and then managing your files by saving them in this fashion has been very useful for us. Questions at the end, or can we ask questions at the end? We'll get to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Cassie. Yeah. So Cassandra did a really excellent job of sharing how you have how no matter where you're from, whether it's EH&S or workers' comp or HR or risk, everybody has some sort of data. It's not about collecting it. Sometimes it's often about consolidating it and putting it together in a way where it can be used and people can take action. And that's how you start to change cultures, is by presenting information so other people can reach the same decisions you're kind of hoping that they would be illustrated in the data. So I'm going to talk about presenting the data. There are some principles that Cassie had kind of gone over in terms of how to pull out kind of patterns in information. Whether you're an analyst or you're a director or you're a training expert, your role when presenting information is twofold. Number one, it's to tell a story. It's to somehow explain what is happening in the world and bring it down to a piece of paper, right? And number two, it's not just to tell a story, but to establish credibility, to make sure that you're presenting something that can be held and stand against tests, so that there is no question about the decision that you want them to reach. So tell a story and establish credibility. An individual from the University of Texas named Dr. Bob Emery, who teaches on measures that matter and how to display them, said this. I thought it was very powerful to share. He said that a successful safety program functions largely in the realm of prevention. And on a good day, nothing happens. But the problem is that as a profession, we're not telling we're not good telling the story at the amount of resources needed to make nothing happen. We often just kind of expect people to appreciate that nothing is happening, and that's what we're doing in our programs, but we don't show how that nothing is happening. And so, to show how nothing is happening, I wanted to touch on at least two historical examples. And the way that I wanted to do this is if I can get you to participate with me. So if you have a cell phone, go ahead and pull it out, and text messages, data rates apply, so if you get charged for this, you can ask Russell Vernon at the end to review you. But if you could, try to pull out this, try to text the number 37607. 37607, text the word UC training to 37607. Again, send a text message to 37607, and the message you're sending is UC training, all one word. I'll give everybody a minute to do that. 37607 is the phone number that you text the text message, and the text message is UC training. And so after you've done that, you should have gotten some kind of a reply. And the question that I'm asking, if you could respond to with the next text, is, what do you think about Napoleon taking over Russia? Why did Napoleon fail to conquer Russia? What do you think? So if you can send a word or two, text a word or two to 37607 after you've logged in with UC Training, that would help me find out what you think and bring it back to displaying data information. So we see that there are a variety of opinions on why Napoleon failed to conquer Russia. We see that some people think it was because it was cold, that there was winter, that he was short and cold, and short's huge. Supply, people were hungry. Let me see if I can actually make this. I can't make this bigger. I'm so sorry. No, I can't make it bigger. Oh, it always happens when you need it. Yeah, it is. Oh, there you go. There you go. Okay, he was angry. He's understaffed. Understaffed is something that plagues EH&S often, so it's good to know that it happened in Russia or France. Syndrome, I think he has short syndrome. They were lost. I think on the left it said strategy is Russia, and he was a man. So Napoleon failed to conquer Russia because he was a man. Desertion. Okay, a variety of examples of why, and I think the man one was a good one. Napoleon failed to conquer Russia for several reasons, which I'm going to show in just one picture using data. This is a historical example telling a story of the losses of the Russian army, and I'm going to try to explain it. It's by an French army, I'm so sorry, French army, excuse me, by an individual named Charles Menard, who kind of showed on the very left-hand side, the very start of the Russian campaign. And what you can see is that, let's see if I can, oh, there you go. On the left, and you can't...
The line indicates how many men were starting.
Exactly. The width of the line shows how many men were starting, and you can't really see, but it was over 420,000 at the very top. And as they advanced east, you can kind of see how they kind of dwindled, not because they took an airplane out in the 1800s, but because they just started to fall off the face of the earth, started to pass away. You see, and once you see black, what you see is there's a set of troops that went this way, and then they started trying to go towards this city, and when it turns black, it meant that they retreated. They retreated, and they left, and they went back home. So as they went east, using this piece of data, this storytelling of data, you'll see that they dwindled almost to, by the time they got to Moscow, to 100,000 troops. From 420,000 and up to 100,000 troops. The sheer distance showed by this data can explain one of the reasons why they all died. And then, as they've turned around, you'll see in the black path how much more that they dwindled. And what you see at the very bottom, well, we can't really see it, is the temperature. When they turned back, it was about 24 degrees, and then it dropped severely about this time to -9 degrees. And that's where you kind of see further dwindling of the army, not just from the sheer distance, but from the temperature. And it increased a little bit, but then dropped all the way to -30 degrees. And so by the time that the French army went from one city to Moscow and back, they ended up with not 425,000, but is this 10 or 4,000 troops at the end. Showing one simple graphic, you can tell a story of the devastating loss due to war. And so this is actually an anti-war poster is how I like to explain it. But it's a powerful way of sharing a story using data, using simple imagery. If you've ever heard of an individual named Edward Tufte, he often speaks to that graph. He is a professor emeritus at Yale University, and he always says that it's not good to just throw out numbers out into the world, 80,000, 60,000, 8,600,000, right? It's important to provide not just a number, but a point of reference so that people can compare, because the fundamental analytical act that people can make is to make comparisons. So whenever you're thinking about throwing data out into the world, make sure you anticipate the question, well, that's great, that data that you just gave me, but compared to what? So with that, I am going to have you participate in another little survey. So if you keep that number open, the question I have next is another historical question. There was a cholera outbreak in 1854 in London, England. What do you think was used to end the 1854 cholera outbreak in London? If you think it was hand washing, text A, 237607. If you think it was a well handle, text B. If you think it was food safety, C. Or vaccination, text D. If you think it was training, because training is awesome, text E, 237607. The question is, what was used to end the cholera outbreak in London, England in 1854? So we get a variety of answers. I'm kind of curious to know what you think. Hand washing or food safety or vaccination or training. I'm going to give you 50 more seconds. What's cool is that it's anonymous, so we really don't know who doesn't know the right answer. So you can text 5 different times all the answers and we won't really know, but that's okay. So hand washing. And you can kind of see using the software that depending on how many people participate, it kind of scales it back. So I'm going to wait for one more until I move on. Did everybody get a chance to participate? And again, data rates apply. Ask Russell Vernon again about that. Okay, so most of you thought that hand washing ended the cholera outbreak. It actually makes sense, right? And that's what we stress often, to prevent disease, right? Wash your hands. It was actually a well handle. And the way that we know that is through an individual named John Snow, a physician who's plotted something that looked like this in the 1800s. All these little dots represent deaths from the cholera outbreak throughout London, England. So here is one dot, there's one death, there's 4 here, there's probably an entire family over here on this block and and cholera spread over here. So throughout the city, you can see a lot of people died. What also you can see are these little X's. There's one here, there's one over up here, another one here and here. And those represented the location of water sources. And so what he had found, John Snow, when he had plotted all the cholera deaths and the location of the water sources, is that right about here in Broad Street, there's an X representing a well handle. And this graphic, this one way of telling a story and showing comparisons of data as compared to something else, helped persuade the local council to disable the well pump. And that was one of the things that had led to the severe decrease or almost an elimination of cholera in London, England in 1854. So a well handle. So whoever the 7 people were, you got that answer right. And if you weren't that, I wouldn't know, so you can just take credit for them. So good. So tell a story using data and make sure you allow people to compare that data to some other point of reference. Here's another thing I'd like you to do. I'm going to give you this picture for the next 20 seconds and ask you to tell me what you see. So what do you see in this picture? Okay. With that, why don't you let me know what you see? Go ahead and text to 37607 any word representing what you saw in that picture. 37607. If you just walked in and you wanted to join, go ahead and text UC Training to 37607. So what did you see? We see old, a piano, we see art, a guest, that's a very good one, the guest. Man walking in, confrontation, pictures, Victorian era, there's family, on the left there's furniture. That's interesting, somebody said concern. Somebody actually was able to look at the faces and identify concern. A widow. Widow is pretty good. What else do we see? Anticipation, unwelcome visitor. Girl looking into the room. A doctor visit, very good. Very, very good. There is a variety. I'm just trying to, uncertainty. Unwelcome visitor, that's kind of an interesting thing. So there's a variety of things that people saw. The point was to show that you saw different things depending on where you looked, and there was a study done in the 1960s that showed this is a general pattern most people followed. They started off with the feet of the person walking in, and they went and saw, oh, there's a face there, this is what the face looked like, and then they jumped right over to the guy in the middle, oh, there's his face or her face, and then number 4, oh, there's a person over there, I think it's a girl, and then they jumped right back to see, oh, well, there's something over here, oh, there's a person over behind that guy who just walked in. So there's a pattern that the eye followed, depending on who you are, when you first look at any picture or any report or anything, even if it's a book. If I didn't give you any instruction, you followed this pattern towards the middle top. Free examination, which is you were all over the place. That's why we had such a variety of words, right? Confrontation, unwelcome visitor, widow, old, all these different things. But if I told you before looking at the picture to guess, what are the ages of the people? What are the ages of people? What you would have done is on the left-hand side, you would have looked at their face, looked down a bit at their clothes, at the next person's face, and down at their clothes, and jumped right here to this face and over here and up and down, and gone right back and forth between their faces and maybe their clothes to figure out their age. It's kind of funny what the mind tries to do to interpret age, right? But if I also told you to remember their clothes, then you would have spent a little bit more time going up and down in each picture. And if I had asked you to guess how long the visitor had been away from the family, you would have skipped the clothes and you would have done this really quick back and forth, back and forth, back and forth to figure out the relationship of people through their expressions, right? So the point of this is to show that vision, perception, is an active process where the eye shifts several times over and over again to try to figure out the significance of what they're being given as an image. And so how this turns back into what we were talking about is don't assume that people know what you're talking about when you throw out a graph, right? Or even just put about a bunch of words. Try to explain it. Try to pull out very specifically with a short set of words, the way that Cassie helped you explain how to describe data. describe those extremes that you want them to see. What are the ebbs and flows? What are the peaks and valleys? Because people will take it for for what they think it is instead of what you're hoping to get across. Here's another example of data visualization. In fact, this is a poor design. I often speak about the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion that happened in the 1980s. I think we're all old enough to know what I'm speaking about. It was when they were trying to put the first teacher into space. And everyone was really excited, and we saw the launch, but then suddenly, right when it got into the sky, broke apart into several pieces. And it broke apart because of something we now know. It's called the O-ring, which is something, a piece of the equipment on the shuttle. And the unfortunate thing is that we actually knew, the engineers knew that it was going to happen based on data they collected around the temperature. What they had said was that if this O-ring, this piece of equipment, this O-ring on the shuttle reached a temperature below 53 degrees, it would fail. And that, in fact, is what happened. On the day of the launch, the temperature was 22 degrees. It was way below 53 degrees. It was so cold that they had to scrape, and this is a real picture of right before the launch, they had to scrape ice off of the launch pad. If somebody had known that this was going to happen, right, that the O-ring would have failed, wouldn't you have thought that they would have made a different launch decision? They would have stopped it right then and there. Well, they did know. But the problem was that they were so inundated, the decision makers were so inundated with information, they were just throwing out so many numbers, so many words, that they couldn't make the conclusion that it wasn't good to launch that day. In fact, all that information, and this is a real letter from the engineers saying that the launch should proceed. The relationships between the temperature and O-ring resiliency were considered not conclusive because people were just so confused with information. And so you can see where they recommended the launch to proceed. So it's not just about collecting data or putting it together, it's about putting it together in a way where people can understand the message, where they can perceive of it. So tell a story, give information so that people can compare what your data is trying to tell them against and explain it, but also simplify it. And so the way that I'm going to really quickly close up on how to simplify it is use the tools that you have, usually on your own computer. Use color, that is, choose a specific color palette to stick with. Don't get crazy with all the different colors. I mean, there are millions of colors, but people can only perceive so much when you put it onto a screen. Use scale. Be very honest about the rise, which is the left-hand axis, and the run, the bottom axis. Don't skew it, but instead use kind of a rule of 50% rise to run, which we'll go over. And label things. Don't require the individual to have to memorize what the legend is about and then perceive of what the graph is trying to tell them. Put it directly on the graph if you can. So I'll show you using good and bad examples. So here's an example of personal, and this is all real data, by the way. Personal reported injuries by population. You can see there are employees, residences in blue, and students in gray, brown, whatever that color is. It would be best to describe this using perhaps a line chart, right? Because every time you have time series, it's best to use a line chart. But particularly what you see first is that you should avoid using default colors. The default colors that come in Microsoft Office are often some of the most offensive, and so you want to get away from having to rely on those and recolor it so that the eye can see very clearly, not from the left graph, but from the right graph, that the total number of injuries severely decreased, not by residents or students, but by employees. And so this is actually a good graph showing some positive change. But you can't really see that when it's in the form of a line graph, a column chart over time. So avoid using default colors and use lines when you're displaying something over time. So another example of laboratory inspections and over time the number of principal investigators that were inspected and whether or not they had violations during the inspection identified. So here's one way of looking at it, of displaying it, which is really, really good. And what I say here is that the rise and run ratio should be 1 to 2. So whatever it is your run is, whatever it is that you're displaying in the bottom, cut that in half and make that your rise. And if you the more that you stick to this, the more you're much more honest in displaying the variations across the different columns. And so that's one thing. But also, color is really, really important. But sometimes just simplifying information through the use of black and white can be as powerful as the use of color. The eye can determine 30%, 20% difference in shades of gray. Actually, I just read the literature on this. It's 30 shades of gray that the eye can determine, not 50. So, and that's really good. So use that. And in fact, that's what we do, right? When we make our copies of all of our reports, we don't use color printing all the time because it's really expensive. We use black and white. And so use the hues and color of blacks and shades of gray to emphasize your message, right? So use a scale that's proper, 1 to 2, 1 up and 2 across, and then use color. And then label. So here's another example of OSHA lab standards and EPA compliance. There are the number of labs audited, out of the total number of labs, and those that are in compliance, right? Very difficult to figure out what this graph is trying to say. What I would do first is just to take away the default grid lines. These lines going across, all they serve is to clutter up the scale or the graph and confuse the mind. Just remove them. And if anything, kind of try to show an empty data. Empty data is data that you did not do, you did not collect. So they don't have 2003 data that can be shown by just a white column. But above all, label directly. And so you can see in 2004 of the possible number of labs that they reached in light blue a certain amount, and the ones that were in compliance were the ones in darker blue. And so that is brought out, and you can't really see it. Oh, I guess you can here. But when you're sitting down and you're looking at this report, this one graphic, if all that people look through is a graphic in your report, and that's at least what I do, I just look for the pictures, then push directly onto that graphic, that label of what you're trying to have them conclude. So place labels directly on graphs, use scale, and use color or 30 shades of gray if you would. And I'm going to use this as my final example. These are real graphs that we were talking about earlier with Russell when we submitted for our budget requests of each nest staffing. It could be any staffing, but what we were trying to show was that extra research was increasing in terms of funding, that the campus was growing, so here's square footage, that students were coming aboard more often than not, student growth was huge, and staffing levels were the same. But this served only to really confuse people. It was kind of pretty when people first looked at it, but it really made no sense. So a simpler way of doing it is just to show simple colors, trend lines, and here's an example of research funding. Here's an example of gross square footage. Note that there's no data on 1995 and 2000, and that's good. I mean, it's not good, but it's better to show honesty that you didn't have that data than to kind of create a scale that is skewed because you're putting one year against another and if you're skipping one. Here's student population, and then each and staffing trends. You can see from the use of coloring, of scale, and just labeling in terms of the trend line that while research is increasing, square footage is increasing, and student population is increasing, each and staffing is staying the same. I think we all feel this way, right? But you can do this not with a bunch of words, but with quick, simple graphs, and graphs that are not so offensive, right? So try to tell a story as compared to something else, right? As Edward Tufte says, as compared to something else, and explain it. Well, you don't see the explanations. And use color. So one of the things that Cassie really, really emphasized that's powerful is there's a lot of information we often put out there with data. You can create wonderful and beautiful reports. And sometimes it's good also to simplify them. Simplify it with what we talked about is an infographic. So here's an example of a full training report on the left side and all the words you could possibly come up with, all the graphs. And then on the right side is the summary for the busy exec, right? There is just a picture of people and representing how many people completed training, showing you really quickly, oh, there's a number there, right? 85%. Well, what does that number, 85% of what, says the mind? Well, the mind wants to read it and then figures out, oh, 85% of the people thought the courses were good or very good. Great. It's very explicit. There's no need to interpret, no need to look at legends and figure out colors. And so infographics are a very, very powerful way of getting a message across very quickly. in consolidation. So again, tell a story. Make sure you give people reference points that they can compare against. Explain it. Simplify it, hopefully using color labeling and scale. But above all, try not to lie, right? It's so easy to come up with graphical deception or cartoons or chart junk. So in this example, what they were trying to show is that the number of McDonald's restaurants far exceeded is very prevalent in certain countries, right? So prevalent, right, in the United States that it's even in the water. It's huge. My goodness. So whereas the large red bubble represents 10,000 plus restaurants. And where is this? New Zealand? New Zealand? Okay. New Zealand has restaurants that almost cover the entire country, right? So, I'm sorry, it's New Zealand beef, right? So it's healthier, I think. So it's not hormone heavy, right? So this is an example of your comparisons need to be one-on-one, not just like crazy like this. So you'll find a lot of these silly graphs in, I think, Fox News. So here's an example on the right side during the elections that 70% backed Palin, 60% backed Romney, and the other backed Huckabee, right? Instead of having separate pie charts, they kind of said, well, we'll just add it all together. Is that like 198% of the people? That's a huge number, right? I like this one, though. People on welfare versus those on full-time jobs. But they're only looking at this little teeny tiny, what in essence is insignificant increase, because their scale is just this little snapshot over what is really a huge column, right? Here's another one where it talks about where Americans spend their money. You can't see it, but it looks like they're spending it on non-mortgage debt payments. 2%, but the 2% is the biggest column instead of the littlest column, 30%, which is actually mostly, what color is that? I think medical? Yet another good example of why you should not use crazy colors. Blacks, hues and shades of gray are better. And cost of gas. The one thing about this that you should pay attention to when you look at data in the news is that they're comparing last year versus last week and today, right? If you spread out last year, it's actually this huge, right? It would go into the next room so don't just kind of say, oh yeah, here's everything. Really try to be honest in your scale, your rise and your runs, and do your math, right? And yeah, just be truthful. There are books, they're wonderful, beautiful graphical books with pictures for people like me that you can look at with this. And some of them I recommend is by Edward Tufte, The Visual Display of Quantitative Information, and Tuki, who's the individual who invented the box plot. So these resources will be posted on the website. You can look at this later. But Edward Tufte, you can just Google Tufte. He does just a really good, great, quick one-day training, and your mind will be blown the next day. You'll change the way you present everything. We also wanted to share that we have done an amazing job of producing these reports that you can use as references of how you can present data or key indicators of programs in environmental health and safety. So everything from accident investigation to fume hood to training. If you would like a copy, just email us, ehs@ecr.edu. We'll be happy to share samples and change names out if we need to. And so I'm going to have Russell finish up. So again, as he walks up, tell a story, make sure you give people references to compare, explain things, use color, scale, and label, and don't lie. Don't lie.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Cassie and Janette. So you can see that we are about telling people what the data is. The truth is that if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. If you measure it and you don't understand how things change over time or where the activity is occurring that you need to affect change in, management is going to be ineffective. And if you can't communicate the message to the decision makers in a way that they have the time to and the willingness to understand, then you're not going to get the resources that you need to affect change. So what you've been shown today, I think, is a summary, quite accurate summary of what we have been doing on our campus, and we're continuing to make improvements on. Why do you care? What is it you're going to measure, and then how are you going to present it? And with that, I'd like to open the panel up to questions. Ms. Carey.
This question is for Ted. What technology do you use for your infographics?
Oh, so if we've actually used, I use PowerPoint more often than not, believe it or not. I just import graphics, and then PowerPoint has ways of cutting out stuff. But there are also free online creators, easily, easely.com. Allows you to, that if you have like a number, like 85%, you put in the number, and then it asks you, what do you want to represent this number? Do you want a person? And then it gives you different people in different poses. Or do you want, I don't know, a tree? And so it's really cool to create infographics with easily.com. I usually go to that one because it's free. You don't have a budget for
Yeah, they've all learned from me that you got to save money, so.
Yeah. Thanks.
Anybody else? Yes, Regina.
How long do you archive your data? You were talking about the organization at that time.
Right now we save everything on our share drive, and we archive as far back as we can. I don't know if there's a better answer for it, but I archive pretty much everything. I'm also do a lot of our purchasing and accounting stuff, and as far as records, I archive everything, and I found that it's very useful. You can also archive from your Microsoft Outlook and your email, so we use email verification all the time. We'll PDF things all the time, so we really archive pretty much everything.
It's gone back at least since I've been director. We've been archiving for about 6 years.
Right, and archiving means a lot of what Cassie showed, which is even if you have a piece of paper showing inspection, you don't want to keep it in a drawer, even if it's from 20 years ago. Take it out, scan it, PDF it, give it to a student, right?
There are guidelines on records retention that have not been really updated for EH&S for a number of years in UC system. So we may go back and decide what the attorneys really want us to archive and what we want to get rid of. Yes, Morgan.
I was just curious, maybe this isn't your domain, but earlier on you were talking about for the respiratory protection program, you pull data from this source and that source and that source. And I find that for things that we do as well, there are like 10 different systems that are, collecting data on a different thing. And do you guys, are you guys thinking of or involved in a way to consolidate some of that into kind of a more centralized database?
The short answer is yes. The long answer is that's why we have Cassie. Initially we had to do with what we had. And I had the choice to hire an executive assistant or someone who could actually help us move the program ahead. And so clearly I made the right decision. And the campus is looking at ServiceNow, or there's a couple other ones that are metadatabases that sit over a bunch of data and you can pull from different sources. It is a challenge, in particular respiratory protection program one, because the fit test equipment has its own proprietary database that's separate from everything else, and so you actually physically have to pull data off that to put it in someplace else. I don't know that we'll ever get entirely away from some physical manipulation of the data, but we're doing our darndest to get to the point where she doesn't have to create an Excel spreadsheets of other data to be able to generate a report. That's our goal.
And to add to that, we collect so much data from our different systems, but I mean, why, right? We shouldn't let it just die there so we can reference it. We should always think about consolidating and then maintaining that consolidated process. So definitely, if you have these systems, and let's think about if you ever leave, will anybody know where your data is and what its purpose serves? Will anybody maintain it? When you start to consolidate it, you start to see what really is important, and then what therefore is data that you really have been collecting for no reason. So.
Yes?
Have you found that you have to spend a lot of time cleaning up data? Pulling data from a lot of different systems?
We didn't show you the data that we couldn't get cleaned up well enough to provide that information. We have some programs that are much greater challenges than others that I don't have data to show you just simply because we couldn't do that. Yes, it's a huge challenge. And essentially you have to provide resources and the concentration towards solving the problem in order to get the problem solved. You won't go to the perfect solution at the beginning, but over time you'll be able to make improvements to it.
And what's interesting I found is, as far as data collection, am I close? as far as data collection and managing it. Once you start generating the reports, once you start putting the effort towards reporting and collecting the data, you'll find that the subject matter experts, at least I have, because I interact with all of the subject matter experts to create their specific reports, they start collecting data where they can in a way that is more manageable to input, or to, hopefully you're not inputting it physically, but once you start showing them how beneficial the reports can be, you can actually stimulate change with them. They start collecting it in a way that's easier to manage and more efficient for everyone. So I think the hard part is just getting people on board and showing them that you're not trying to show where they're deficient or where the program is lacking, but how we can, change the safety culture, and people start really being more conscious of, okay, how can I collect this in a way that's better? Is that our time?
Obviously, you get the background music. I'm impressed. I think they're trying to tell us we're at the end of the hour. Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah.
There you go. You can, Janette, can we stop it? Just hit stop.
Yes, please. Thank you.